Hello and welcome to this working lunch on the rise of the blockchain. Blockchain technologies have been around for a while, sometimes called just distributed ledger technologies. It's lunchtime and I can't get my mouth around that. So the blockchain has become increasingly important in trade and trade finance over the last 6-7 years as a way of managing fraud, as a way of managing compliance, and as a way of managing security as well. Increasingly, what we're beginning to look at, though, is the role of blockchain solutions and especially cryptocurrencies in enabling finance for, let's say, emerging markets and let's say as well small and medium-sized companies. So there's a big role for tokenized finance in countries in particular where they're kind of skipping the ordinary payment systems. So it's an exciting area, and with me to discuss this are two consummate professionals and experts in the field. I'm delighted to welcome Alisa DiCaprio, who is Head of Strategy at R3, and Arnoud Busman, who is founder and CEO of Minehub. And I'm going to get them both to introduce each other, not to introduce themselves to each other, not because we don't know them, but because they don't know each other. So Alisa, maybe you could go first and just say a little bit about what your role at R3 is.
Sure, great. Thank you, Rebecca. I'm very excited to be here. I'm very excited to meet Arnoud. Hello. So I work at R3, which is a blockchain platform company. We don't build applications, we just build the blockchain. And there I work on trade, central bank digital currencies, digital assets, mainly everything that we're building for the financial sector and for trade moving forward, which is pretty interesting. It gives me a kind of holistic view of what's happening in the permission blockchain space, which is what R3 is. So I hope to be able to talk about that a little bit today.
Cool. Ali.
Yeah, thanks. And nice to meet you, Alisa, indeed. So I'm Arnoud, CEO at Minehub. Minehub is a blockchain-based platform enterprise as well, focused on digitalizing physical commodity supply chains, bringing efficiency, transparency, security to these supply chains, as well as responsibility, particularly from an ESG perspective. Before ING, I was with ING Bank for 10 years, working in their commodities business primarily. And in that context, had a lot of exposure to the challenges of risk management if you're relying on paper-based evidence or information coming from sources that have yet to be authenticated, right? So 2016, we started looking, and when I say we, that's at ING, started looking at how can we use the emerging blockchain technology to build digital platforms and enable digital platforms, particularly from a data governance perspective. So we set up ventures in energy, in commodity trade finance, in soft commodities, also very close to the work that R3 was doing with ING, particularly on projects like Voltron at the time and now Contour. In 2018, I started looking at mining and metals and got ING involved in a project that was starting up in Vancouver called Minehub. And in 2019, I jumped over the fence and took on the CEO role there. And now we're building this out. We've got I think a nice platform performing. We're rolling out apps, particularly for trade finance and ESG. And the topic of this session, Rebecca, is fantastic. Looking forward to it.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's dig straight into it. And I will say to the audience as well, this is working lunch, so don't just rely on me to ask the questions. The idea is that we get a really good discussion going here about the capacity of blockchain, not just to solve problems for emerging markets by bringing cryptocurrencies into emerging markets and to solve some of the big fraud and risk problems, but also to look at ESG and ESG solutions as well. And Anu and I could probably bore for England on that subject. So let's get going then. So, I mean, trade finance, Alisa, to this point has remained largely manual. There are a huge number of manual processes. I mean, I think the estimates are something around 70% of all trade finance is actually still in manual, and it might even be higher than that. But what we're beginning to see is that emerging markets are beginning to skip the system. So they're beginning to skip from traditional paper-based solutions because those have costs of implementation, and they want to go straight to digital solutions. Now, our own discourse analysis, and we've looked at digital solutions for the ICC around the world, and our own discourse analysis is showing that there are alternatives to blockchain which are beginning to be talked about in the public domain. So in particular, talking about AI, cloud-based solutions and so on. Is blockchain, just for the non-experts in this panel, blockchain and cloud-based solutions essentially similar things? Can they do the same thing? And how can they help solve some of the problems that are out there?
That's a great question to start with. So I think I'm going to say yes, that there's a lot of things that blockchain does that other technologies can also do. Blockchain does things that other technologies can't do, but I think one of the important things that we see today is that a lot of problems are being recast as AI problems or as blockchain problems, rather than being a problem with insurance or a problem with trade finance. And so I think, this function of looking at things like this, really allows us to, is why you see blockchain being used throughout the economy or throughout in different sectors. I think a lot of times blockchain, the word, is actually being used as a catalyst for digital transformation. So there's plenty of processes where, for example, with Contour or with Marco Polo, where the process itself isn't radically changing because you're using blockchain. But blockchain is the reason that companies and banks are able to say, okay, well, we've always dealt in paper, but now we don't need to because we're using this blockchain-based solution. So I think that the difference between blockchain and these other technologies is with blockchain, you can do some things with a much lower level of engineering complexity. So you could have built a lot of this stuff out before, but it would have been incredibly difficult, right? For example, you can use smart contract. You don't need blockchain to do smart contracts, but it becomes a lot easier. And so that's why you see this uptake of different parts of blockchain so much, especially in trade finance, because a lot of these processes are where you really needed this initial push.
I think that's something very interesting there. There's this kind of balance, isn't there, between technology as a tool and technology as an end in itself. And quite often we start to talk about technology as if it is blockchain that is driving trade, and it isn't. Trade is essentially the problem that blockchain is trying to solve.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And what is specifically the problem in trade at the moment? I know that we're trying to resolve. Do you think what is this inappropriate technology for? It's been used extensively for fraud and security. And maybe you'd like to elaborate on that a little bit, and then we can start to look at how it can adapt and adjust to the current set of circumstances and the current challenges we face.
Yeah, sure. So from my perspective, and why we're using blockchain is it's a number of things, right? For me, it's around data governance. That's the primary one. So if we have and I think it's the CTO of R3 actually, he described it very nicely in 2016. So if we are going to a lot of these processes in trade rely on a continuous sharing of information. It's the same information that's being shared between 20, 30 parties that are involved in these transactions. It's done via bilateral channels. So whether it's a courier bag or an email, or it's in somebody's head that yells it out to someone across the floor, or it's bilateral, it's different formats, different media, usually different versions of the truth that are floating around. And a lot of time people are not using that information, they're just reconciling it, trying to figure out if the information is correct and whether the authenticity is there. So that for me, that's the heart of the problem. And why blockchain can solve that is, I think everybody recognizes that problem, you can solve it if you just got a central database. You just share the data and everybody sees it, just like SAP does within an enterprise. But there is no SAP in an enterprise, there's just all these channels. So the way the R3 CTO posted at the time was, who's going to be the database administrator? Is it God? Is it ICC? Is it, who's going to do that, right? So there's no natural party that has the right to do that. And yet nobody will trust one of their competitors to do it on their behalf. Or potentially a third-party small company, a couple of guys in a garage in Vancouver. So that's not necessarily going to work either, right? So for me, this is where blockchain provides solution in decentralizing the governance and custody of that information. So that's yeah.
So what I was going to say was, sorry, I interrupted you, but it's in other words, it's basically a database, isn't it? So I mean, that kind of demystifies a lot of what's going on. It's a technology that runs a database, and the database itself becomes a single source of truth because the database becomes immutable.
Correct. You can rely on the information. You don't have to reconcile it. You can trust it, and no, the information doesn't disappear. It doesn't mean that everything is transparent or visible to everyone, like on some of the public blockchains. It's more that that the parties that have right to access data can access that data and can rely on it. Now, the second thing that this decentralized governance, data governance architecture brings is that as a user, you can control who has access to your data, rather than that you trust a third party as a custodian of your data assets, which can be super valuable, highly regulated, commercially sensitive data. Why would you give it to a third party to look after? What you can do is take control of those data assets. You decide who you share it with. You decide also where it's stored. The data residency is a quite important, increasingly important component from a compliance perspective. So particularly if we want to build cross-border blockchains into, for instance, jurisdictions like mainland China, you need to comply with local cybersecurity and data regulations, which essentially demand data residency on mainland China soil for the origin of data. So how do you solve that problem? If your data is somewhere on an Amazon server in wherever, you can't control it, right? So that challenge is addressed as well through that.
But Alisa, if I could bring you in there, that's actually quite a different perception or reality of blockchain to the one that's popularly put out there. I mean, this whole idea of everything being decentralized and kind of publicly available, and it gives lie to this idea that that it's all decentralized and actually fairly random, because where blockchain is usually seen is actually in the cryptocurrency world. So what we're actually doing in trade is something quite different, isn't it, to something that happens using blockchain as a mechanism for payments, for example, or a mechanism for investing.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly correct. I mean, the uses of cryptocurrency are fairly specific, right? I mean, the use cases as payments, and where you see different use cases, for example, with public blockchains like Ethereum, it's largely because they're forking it, right? Or creating different types of security around it. Because, when you're talking about trade, you need to know every party that's part of the transaction. And that's incredibly important, right? There can't be any ambiguity about where your goods are, or what ship is taking them, or what bank is financing it. Whereas, when you're talking about cryptocurrency, there's not that identity element to it. You have an address, it may or may not link to your actual legal identity. And so there's this ambiguity that's taken away by the types of decentralization that we're talking about here.
So I mean, Arnoud, that goes back to what you're saying about the decentralized database and about this actually being a source of information, because essentially the problem we're trying to solve in trade finance is one of transparency in the transaction, not the transaction itself at this stage, but there might be a role for it in the future, perhaps.
Absolutely. It's bring that transparency to lenders so they can monitor the assets that they're financing and the transactions they're financing in real time. So for me, that's more about data authenticity and timing of data than business process and workflows. But, absolutely.
And both of you have talked a little bit about digital IDs, and for people who don't necessarily know about digital IDs, these are things that go through, for example, the legal entity identifier foundation, which give a digital footprint to the business. Now, those are actually they're highly structured, and you as a business have to pay for them. So, I mean, there's a transition, isn't there, between turning this into, if you like, a supply side tool for banks to something that works on the demand side as well, which is for companies actually to be able to use these things as a way of making their trade finance and their trade experience, their exporting experience, smoother?
I agree with that, but I would take issue a little bit with the cost implication there, because I think the way that we see blockchain and trade finance working today is that most of the costs are being absorbed by the banks that are using it, that are putting it in place. Those costs are not passed on to, for example, the small and medium-sized enterprises that might be part of the supply chain, and that are using it. There's different ways you can architect that. So, for example, what we see a lot of our projects using is multi-tenancy. So you have a node, and this gets a little bit technical, but I think, given that we're talking about supply chain, already technical, when you have supply chain, you might have 1,000 suppliers and one buyer, as one example. So what you can do is, rather than having 1,000 suppliers, each of them having a node plus the buyer, which means that you have to know how to run a server, how to do updates. It becomes, pretty complex. And for a small and medium-sized enterprise, they may not be interested or willing or able to understand, this type of computing complexity. You can instead have a multi-tenant node, which is run by the buyer or run by the bank, with identities for all of the suppliers. So they can access that, but don't actually need to service it, which I think is a lot of the problem. So I think there, where you have the identity being run by the bank already, and the bank has already done KYC on those suppliers, that becomes a lot less costly for the SME. In fact, they don't even necessarily need to know that blockchain is running this type of relationship that they have.
That's really interesting, because it links absolutely to the ESG agenda, and there's a question coming in on energy resources, which I'll take in a minute. But let's get there by another route, because I think the interesting question is those, let's say, 1,000 SMEs with one buyer might not necessarily be sustainable. So what we're beginning to see, and the big challenge that we're beginning to see in supply chain finance now, as the results of COP come through, as the sort of new regulations and EU taxonomies and the ICC paper yesterday and all of those things start to develop, is that supply chains are actually going to become regulated and more compliance driven, unless we are very, very careful. And just to give you an example, I was talking to someone the other day from a large consultancy organization, and they said, well, this large consultancy organization had a client that was buying from 1,500 Indonesian palm oil manufacturers. And those 1,500 Indonesian palm oil manufacturers weren't necessarily able to comply with all of their ESG criteria. So they said, right, we're going to get rid of all of those on compliance grounds, because we can't do it. We just can't work with all of those, and just replace them with one, because it makes life simpler. Now, that's a blockchain solution in the end, isn't it? But it's also a sustainability question, because if we're going to be able to enable those 1,500 Indonesian palm oil manufacturers to become sustainable, then this is precisely the type of solution that we need, isn't it? Arnoud, how can Minehub help with that?
Well, it's a good one. That's exactly what we are working on, and starting to bring that intersection between supply chains, trade finance, and ESG, bring it together as one integrated solution. There's a couple of aspects to ESG, and as we're developing our product, we do distinguish between the let's say classic traceability of sustainability data points and emissions accounting, which is also an important one, particularly under COP. So on both those topics, we recognize that these are value chain challenges. You need to, as a company, scope 1 and scope 2, you can get a grip on your own activities and how you manage that and report on it, etc. And I think most companies are doing the right thing in that regard. But getting a grip on scope 3 means having a good understanding, continuously updated, of what your value chain is doing. So it's your suppliers, your customers, the carriers that are involved, how they are producing the materials that you buy, and how they're consuming the materials that you sell to them. And that same value chain challenge goes back to the ESG, the more broader sustainability and ethical sourcing principles that you have around what's the water management of a copper mine in Chile, what is the Modern Slavery Act compliance of a mining company, cobalt mining company in DRC, right? So what does that do? What does my EV battery composition look like from an ESG perspective? So those are value chain challenges that no company can solve by themselves, and huge data point, the sets of data points that need to be collected and maintained and managed. And the only way to do it is to create like a shared accounting system, shared register for all those parts in the value chain to contribute information and be able to verify that in a secure manner. And that's exactly where I think the blockchain technology provides a unique solution that is pretty hard to achieve any other way. And that's what we're working on as well.
And what's the R3 approach to all of this? I mean, it's the same set of issues, isn't it? For R3, and the ESG element to what you're doing is important. I know that.
Well, I think, you know, on the R3 side, I would say there's two answers. The first is, one of the things that I've seen over the past, maybe I would say 6 months, it's actually been fairly recent, is that a lot more of the supply chain applications that we have building on Corda, so remember, these are not built by us, these are sort of built by the ecosystem, have an ESG focus. So it's, for example, it's actually not that different, Rebecca, from the example that you gave, where, you know, we've had, for example, a large buyer come to us and say, look, our CEO came out and said that we are going to have full traceability into our supply chain. It's going to be sustainable in, you know, 2025. And he's like, we have no way to do that. So, you know, can we use blockchain for this, and how would that, you know, help? So a lot of it is about supplier compliance with buyer requirements, or, you know, different commitments that the buyers have made. So really a large push very recently with that. You know, even a year ago, I didn't see that much. I mean, occasionally there would certainly be, for example, banks that were looking at, you know, green bonds or different ways to finance sustainable suppliers. But it's really been a big push very recently. And I think the second part of that answer is really, you know, what is R3 doing as a company, right? You know, we run the blockchain, we run a bunch of nodes, we design it in certain ways. And I think, you know, very recently, maybe 2 weeks ago, we actually released a blog that where we spent a little bit of time going into the energy usage per transaction of Corda applications. Of Corda sort of generally aggregating all of our applications, because we get that question a lot. Because people kind of have this view of, oh, you know, Bitcoin, which is hugely energy inefficient, but also only has one use case, which is payments, and then has a very specific type of setup, right? They have suggested hardware, for example, for mining that you would use. So there's a lot of data about that. But there's, for the private permission blockchains, or basically blockchains that are not public, you don't have that kind of data, because there's not just one set of machines doing this, and you're not only doing one type of transaction, right? Some of the transactions require a number of state changes. Some of them require one, for example, even with our payment application. So it was a challenge to kind of figure out what is the right, first of all, what is the right algorithm, the right equation to use, and second of all, how do we measure that in a way that's comparable? So we came out with that last week, which is pretty cool. I'm, you know, happy to post it.
Absolutely, that'd be fantastic. I mean, I guess what I would say is, when we run our analysis, you know, we started doing some work on ESG scoring as well, and when we run the analysis on ourselves, then, you know, generally speaking, we can get ourselves quite a high score. We're not doing anything that is particularly bad. But the one thing that we're doing is that gives us 3 out of 6 against the EU taxonomy criteria is greenhouse gas emissions, because we're data processing, we're not running a blockchain. So this question about how we make the blockchain sustainable itself in the future is actually a really important one, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely thought it was, but I mean, it sounds easy to measure. It is not. And there's a lot of caveats in this thing that we wrote. The engineers, you know, had one very specific idea about it. The business people had a different. I mean, it's really a challenge. You have to make a lot of assumptions, and I think people often forget that. It seems fairly straightforward, but this is not something where we have numbers. It's not something where different companies are doing comparable things. So it's really a challenge to measure this, in my opinion.
And Arnoud, actually, that applies across the piece, doesn't it, with sustainability? What we measure and how meaningful those measurements are actually really important, aren't they? In this whole blockchain space, because we've got stuff that's actually, not absolutely transparent to the whole ecosystem, it makes measurement of our own sustainability actually quite difficult.
Well, particularly if your own sustainability is derived from the services that you consume in your daily operations. I would argue, and I think data centers are actually becoming quite a significant source of emissions. So everybody has their part on it. But one of the things around measurements is also understanding where to prioritize your investments, being able to see where can I get the biggest impact of my investments. And so for me, that's still in supply chains, because most of the emissions globally come from supply chains. It's the whether it's the extraction of natural resources, whether it's the processing of iron ore into steel, whether it's shipping the iron ore to a steel mill or stuff like that. So that's the big where there's a significant impact to be achieved. I love the greenhouse gas emissions model. I think it's fantastic because there's no hiding. You get caught somewhere. Everybody gets caught in, and you need to do something about it. And particularly if you start bringing tools like what R3 is supporting in the ecosystem we're building on supply chains, it makes it very transparent, accessible. One thing I'd like to add to the why I think the supply chain and the let's say the emissions accounting and the traceability are so close to each other. To date, many of the use cases have been around traceability of materials, or they have been, let's calculate the emissions footprint of a particular supply chain, which is great, right? But why do it separate? Why are emissions not an integral part of the material specifications that you're shipping? Why is I wouldn't say the child labor content, but let's say whether there's child labor involved or not, why is it not an integral part of the specifications? And that's why we can start decommoditizing it. So these digital platforms for trade, for supply chain, for trade finance, they're actually perfect vehicles as well for transporting that kind of information.
I think I mean I would have to agree with you, but what I would also say is, and this is because I'm an economist, and so I always see things from a supply and demand perspective. So I'm always thinking about where the market is for all of this. And unless you have businesses that can actually come on and use this in a way that helps them, either through, PDS2, sharing data, and this goes back, or whether it's through some kind of hooking a blockchain up with tokenized payment systems. In other words, cryptocurrencies, particularly in emerging markets. I'm banging on about this because it's the products of some work that we've done recently in Africa, where the very clear message in technology that came out of that, if we are going to help Africa and African exporters and intra-African trade in the way that we want to, then the blockchain solutions that are out there also need to be able to engage in that whole trade facilitation process. So it needs to be easier for companies to engage with the blockchain, to share their data on a blockchain in a secure way. And there's a huge education process in all of that as well, because it's people are not confident about all of this. Alisa, is that something you find in R3?
I certainly agree with the statement that people are not confident about blockchain. I think that is definitely true, but I disagree a bit with the point that it's difficult and that the small and medium-sized enterprises have to engage with blockchain to use it. And this gets back to the point I mentioned before, is that most of our larger trade finance products, like Marco Polo, like Contour, I keep wanting to call it Voltron because of Arnoud's mentioning that earlier. Thanks a lot.
So maybe you can call it ELOC, Alisa.
Oh no, oh, even worse. That was like the original name. So, I think with those projects, they've made very, very deliberate decisions to make sure that, in fact, the suppliers that use them don't need to engage with the blockchain. They engage the way that they had before with their bank. That process hasn't changed. And that was pretty important because blockchain can be a really scary thing, right? I mean, if you're a small and medium-sized enterprise, you don't have necessarily a very diversified management structure. You don't necessarily have somebody who is responsible for, IT issues outside of, your direct relationship with your bank. And so at least in the first stage, I think it's been very important. And I think we see this with most of the projects to not make it disruptive for the smallest suppliers in the supply chain. It can be disruptive for the bigger buyers, for the bigger banks, that's fine. But I think there's been a big effort to make sure that, in fact, it is not a challenge for the SMEs.
Is there a policy element to all of this? I mean, can some of the supranational structures like, the World Trade Organization or, the African Continent Free Trade Area, are they able to legislate for some of this or at least provide frameworks and standard frameworks for all of this in order to enable the communities that we're talking about to come in and actually accept that this needs to be done in order to skip the manual payments process?
It's an interesting question, and I think particularly a lot of these projects also start out from the banks, and it's still not unambiguous. I'm not sure whether I'm doubling up on negatives there,
double negatives.
But cryptocurrencies in the context of financial institutions is still a little bit of a tricky area. I think there's fear about whether to go there or not, whether to talk about it or not. Even for myself, being a listed company working, having close connections to banks, I'm not even sure whether I should talk about that topic, but I will anyway. But I see a lot of opportunity for that, and if these supranational organizations can provide frameworks that are relatively straightforward for national governments to adopt, and that there are some leaders that are showing the way, I think that can definitely create a massive solution. I can't wait for the day that there's delivery versus payment, that we can use programmable money that verify whether conditions of a trade have been met, and immediately funds are transferred through whether CBDC rules or other. I have a lot of interest in what's happening out in the DeFi markets, particularly in where I see pools of stable coin liquidity that are sitting there looking for yield. That on the one hand, lending it to crypto traders, which makes sense, but why not lend it to physical commodity traders? So that's the bridge where I'm very interested in exploring, particularly as you see some of the desks within the financial institutions are starting to blend, let's say the stable coins and the fiat coins.
Alisa, what is going on in this space from your perspective? Because it is a super interesting area, and one that, again, I'm coming back to me as an economist, but as an economist, I would say, well, actually, why not have crypto in trade? Why not? Because in actual fact, it's as close to a fiat version of a currency as you could get in the crypto world, because it's associated with a value, it's associated with a transaction. So it's actually, in terms of where currency and money in exchange started against the value of a good as a store of value, it's a currency, it's a fiat currency. So why not? Am I being too controversial on this?
No, I think that's an interesting way to look at it. I agree that I think crypto is a difficult sell. Where you see banks engaging with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, it's largely for trading, right? It's largely the investment part of this, buying and selling for profit, rather than using it as a form of
vehicle
payment.
Yeah.
Right. I think where you do, and what Arnoud was getting at, was kind of the stable coin space, or the central bank digital currency coming in the future, where you do have a digital representation or of an asset-backed token, effectively. The challenge with that, I would say, is the regulation. So I've been working recently on a paper trying to classify tokens in just kind of like an easy way that we could use to talk to people, because I realize that everybody's definition of a stable coin is kind of different. You know, is it asset backed? Is it credit backed? Is this fiat? And the regulations are also changing very quickly. So I think there's a lot of potential in the stablecoin space, of course. But we also have to be pretty sensitive to the fact that the regulations are changing in different countries at different speeds. They're regulating different things, which gets back maybe a little bit to your earlier point about whether it helps when you have these large institutions like ICC and WTO kind of pushing this agenda forward. I think to some extent it does, because there's different legislative changes that need to be made in every country to allow these sorts of things. Not even just stable coins. I mean, even just electronic documents, right? You know, we've done a lot of work with that. Or where there are electronic, rules that have been issued. For example, ICC has the EUCP. Companies are still not using that because they're more comfortable with the previous way of doing things, which uses paper. So I think, it's really around the regulatory element that will, I think, determine how much uptake there is in the kind of formal financial sector using this as a form of payment in an existing flow.
To some extent, and Arnoud, this goes straight into what you're doing at Minehub. It goes into the type of ecosystem, technology, blockchain ecosystem that you can then develop with it, doesn't it? Because it's about how you facilitate everything from end to end. It's about the payment, it's about the AML, it's about the KYC, it's about the sustainability. It's the whole ecosystem that needs to be not just managed in a technological format, but also regulated for as well. So these standards need to exist, don't they?
Absolutely, and I'm closely following also the work that guys at the ICC, particularly Digital Standards Initiatives, are coordinating, facilitating, because that's exactly right. Now, it's also optionality is also important in this space. So there's to assume that one standard will rule them all and within the next year is probably not realistic. So where we're focus on is how can we enable an evolution rather than a revolution, and how can we provide optionality, because companies will have made investments in adopting particular standards, even if it's their own standard within their group. So how do you make sure that those investments, that you don't get into a situation where a company to make that transition to this new networked architecture and infrastructure, how can you avoid that company having to choose between the new world or staying with the old world? I think that's the wrong question to ask. So you need to be able to leverage your existing investments as you slowly migrate to the new world. So if there's a on Minehub, it's important to be able to provide an electronic bill of lading, for instance, as a data structure. But is there one? No, we need to support them. All the main ones need to be supported. Are we going to replace SAP? No, absolutely not. We connect to SAP. Are we going to replace Swift? Absolutely not. I'd love to build a gateway to Swift. Are we going to have our own cryptocurrency on Minehub? Probably not. But we'd like to facilitate different payment rails as they are needed. So it is creating this coordinating, integrating solutions for an ecosystem whilst maintaining optionality is, I guess, the key bit. And the way to do it is, rather than trying to standardize at an application level or even at the standard level, enable that at a data level, interoperability at the data level.
I think this interoperability at the level of the data, and as a data and analytics rather than as a blockchain company, that's what obviously gets me excited, because I then start to think, well, how can we help generate the data? What type of mechanisms? How can we use the existing data that's out there, aggregate it, and provide that into blockchain solutions? And there's a really interesting, I mean, as you know, we're very interested in this ESG space, and today and this week has all been about using technology, digitization, and sort of the energy behind trade and trade finance getting towards sustainability to achieve ESG goals, which aren't just environmental ones, they're social and governance ones as well. And I think blockchain is very good on the governance side. Maybe we're getting there on the environment side because it's like the it's like the easy win, isn't it? Because it's easier to measure perhaps than social objectives. But there's a question coming through here. First of all, in fact, two questions which are quite interesting. First of all is on the actual technology that you use in the interest of making the blockchains themselves more sustainable. So do you know if your platforms use proof of work or proof of stake blockchain technologies? And if it's proof of work, have you considered moving to proof of stake? That's a really technical question. But the other question, which is probably related to that in an ESG context, is there any research anywhere about creating sustainable development goals, ESG related global currencies? So actually using performance in ESG terms against a currency as a store of value. Do you know of any?
So I can kind of take a stab at those questions.
Go for it.
I think, okay, so the first question about proof of work, proof of stake, I posted the blog that I was talking about in the chat. Look at that. That will answer that question. The short answer is those are those are the way that public blockchains work. So for Corda, we're not a public blockchain, so it doesn't use mining. The problem when you measure different energy capacity of blockchains is you're looking at the consensus mechanism. And if the consensus mechanism uses mining, that's where the energy inefficiencies happen. And so, proof of work is the worst, proof of stake gets a little bit better. The consensus mechanism that Corda uses is very different from both of those. That's only 3 blockchains, but I think what you need to do is make this distinction between public and private permissioned. Private permissioned is where you have this identity element, right? Where you're able to understand exactly who is using it without an additional layer of engineering. Now, the second question kind of around whether there could be ESG in digital currencies, that is something, when you're looking at the work that's being done by the central banks right now, because most of the CBDC, like the digital central bank currencies, where it would be kind of an addition to M0. I have not seen any analysis of ESG for those, but I think the reason is because it's so early. I mean, they're still trying to make design decisions. They don't even understand who would issue it. Is it going to be the central bank? Is it going to be central bank issuing to commercial banks, which are distributing? How is it distributed? How is it used? Is it direct? Is it indirect? So I think it's just too early in that conversation. But that certainly would be something interesting to consider.
I'll pick the reply to that one as well, because it's first one, same as Alisa. Yeah, we're running on Hyperledger Fabric, different protocol to Corda. Also private permissioned ledger doesn't need proof of work or proof of stake to achieve consensus in that regard. Yeah, you should be able to run it on an iPhone pretty much from an energy consumption perspective. Now, on the second one, it triggered me because I think the concept is really good. It is in a way happening. So what we're looking at Minehub is saying, well, we're capturing emissions footprint of transactions as the transaction progresses. So we know what materials being moved from where to where, even if the discharge port changes. We know the vessel that's moving it. We know the emissions footprint of that vessel given a certain payload on the certain cargo volume. So that information we can already calculate it, which means that the step to going for a transaction, say press a button, not everybody likes the concept of offsets, but once you've reduced, maybe an offset can help get the final bit close. But if you press a button, say offset this transaction, you basically can go off to a carbon market, which are appearing, and we're working with a couple of them where they are tokenizing streams of carbon credits coming from eligible projects into almost fungible tokens that you can buy and consume. So in a way, if you think about a transaction being you've got a currency to pay in from the buyer to the seller from a financial value perspective, but there's an ESG component that you should also really pay for at source, pay as you go, and then you can see those tokenized carbon streams becoming currencies. So I think we're not that far off, and conceptually it's very close.
It's really super interesting because I mean it ties in with what we were talking about earlier, which is the need to stop or the need to stop the ESG agenda becoming a compliance nightmare, using blockchain to stop it from being like AML and KYC. So actually having something like a cryptocurrency that's based on ESG performance rather than everything else might be a way of positively encouraging companies and organizations to become more sustainable. What focus do you have on enabling that type of process? So actually not just using all of the mechanisms to provide feedback to a bank that this transaction or that transaction is sustainable or otherwise. How do you actually help the businesses, the supply chains to become more sustainable using blockchain?
I think it comes back to information. I mean, a blockchain itself doesn't necessarily make a company more sustainable. It's more what do you do as a company with the information that you capture and then and use and share through that blockchain. So for us, it's the strategy, and I think there are other platforms as well, is to embed ESG related information as business as usual part of the specifications. So every brand that's being shipped, whether you could argue we've got iron ore content or copper content, why not emissions content, right? Well, what is really different, and how can you start decommoditizing along those lines? So it's as soon as you can bring it as an integral part of the material specifications at a product level, and you can track how the product moves along a value chain, you can account for it and automate that process. That's not an additional burden of compliance. That's just normal work. You can evidence it. It can be pre-audited. And I think that's where the power comes in.
And Alisa, that goes back to what you were saying about the business as usual point about making this something that is really simple to implement. The SMEs don't necessarily need to know that that's what's going on. They can, as long as they still have access to everything that they need to have access to. I guess the issue is, will there be companies that get left out by this process? Will the scoring system, the business as usual system, mean that some companies and smaller organizations are going to be left out?
Well, I think the reason that it's happening that way today is because it's the beginning of this technology. So I think that we're going to see this change in the future, because of course the whole benefit of blockchain is all of the new things that it can do, right? It opens up these abilities to do things that we never thought about before, right? So when Arnoud is talking about, for example, having ESG measurements as part of the reporting structure, like this would be amazing. We don't do this today because it's really hard, and it's really hard to do that in a credible way, which is where blockchain can help out, right? I mean, lots of companies are like, hey, we're super sustainable. And then you find out that they're, mining cobalt in, mines where they shouldn't be. So, I think blockchain really lends the credibility to that in a way that's pretty important. But so, my comment about how today it looks like nothing's different. Well, in 5 years from now, maybe everybody will be on, maybe all of the governments will have updated their legislation and allow for electronic documents, and customs officials will be willing to accept electronic documents that come via blockchain, right? I mean, this is until all of the different pieces are together, you want to start out small, because if something goes wrong, you want to be able to fix it. And so if you've replaced the entire trading system with blockchain, I mean, that would be amazing. Don't get me wrong. I think you should do that. But if you did that and something went wrong, who would fix it? That would be a giant disaster. So I think it's just a growth path, right? I mean, in the beginning, you take the process, you make sure it doesn't change too much for your sort of edge customers, and then you make it more efficient. And as everybody becomes used to the process, then you grow it out and out. And that's really where you start going into the kind of blue sky vision of blockchain.
That's an interesting point. Yeah. So I guess the way I look at it, blockchain is a data game. It is a database, but we're adding an additional dimension to data in blockchains, which is the authenticity of data, like who created it and what's the provenance of a piece of data, which lends it credibility so you can use it. And for me, that's the big game changer. I mean, if you're doing a trade, if you're a financier of a commodity transaction, your borrower might give you a piece of paper that gives the inspection certificate, saying here, this is it. It's much better if you know that it actually comes from the guy that issued the certificate, the inspector, rather than from secondhand information, right? So, and that's the bit that we can achieve. So if we can build that pre-audited, pre-validated data infrastructure, I think that's where a massive disruptive power comes from.
But that's the interesting point, isn't it? And you've said it yourself. It's about the authentication. So if you've got a system, a blockchain system under one regulatory environment, and you talked about this in the context of China and data nodes and so on, you've got one blockchain somewhere, and then you've got a different set of regulatory requirements somewhere else, and a different set of regulatory requirements somewhere else. So the blockchain is only as good as the regulatory environment that it's sitting in.
Depends on what the regulations require. What I've seen in jurisdictions is primarily data residence is a key one, and how it's being processed and how it's being shared cross border. So I think the blockchain is a perfect example of enabling compliance with that. Now, if the regulations then say you're not allowed to use blockchain, then that's a different one, of course. But there's also hybrids in the sense that the promise of data privacy is a key one. So if I'm a commodity trader, the transactions I'm running, my counterparties, the contracts, the pricing, the quality parameters, it's all super private because that's how I compete in the market, that's how I make my money. So privacy is important. I think the encryption methodology, data access rights, management, etc., that the blockchain brings is superb for that. Not unique, but superb. But then you've got jurisdictions where they say, well, yes, you can have it private, but if I as a government want to have a look, then I should be able to do that, right? So you need to give a key. And again, you can provide solutions for that as well. So I think it's a versatile technology for data compliance regimes as well.
I would add to that a little bit. I think, yeah, it's definitely the movement of digital data is where this becomes a problem. I think the way that you see blockchain projects today, where it has limited, so governments don't make blockchain illegal. I mean, they don't have that level of interest. What happens is there's regulations that require that documents are paper, right? This is particularly with negotiable instruments are a big problem. Bills of lading, big problem. Most countries they define those instruments as paper, as being written, being signed. There's different ways that they do it. So the way the blockchain projects get around it is you write a contract, right? So everybody that's part of your ecosystem signs this contract that this is we'll follow, I don't know, the Hong Kong law or UK law. And if something goes wrong, and that limits the power of blockchain. I mean, because the whole point of being decentralized is that everybody can use it, and you can have these free flows of assets and data, but you can't do that if you're using a contract. But that's just how the world works today because of these regulations in the different jurisdictions. So I think that's a pretty important distinction. Is since data today is more often transmitted digitally, we need the regulations to catch up, and they certainly have not.
And I mean, this is one of the areas where the World Trade Organization has come under quite severe criticism for not actually having any type of structure or capability to create that rules-based order effectively. We're coming towards the end of the slot. This has been a really, really, really interesting conversation. And I want to ask both of you to stare into a crystal ball a little bit. We run these events. This is our third event, and we run them annually around about at this time, and they're called the Future of Strategy because it's all about looking at what the future is going to look like, how businesses need to plan in the coming year, and what they need to do in order to be able to achieve what people are saying is going to happen this time next year. So generally speaking, amongst the delegates and amongst the conversations that we've been having, there's a sense of optimism around ESG. We are beginning to get to the point where technology can help achieve sustainability goals, and technology itself can become more sustainable, and that the future of trade can actually become sustainable as well. So from your perspectives, in 12 months' time, where are we going to be and what do we have to do to get there? Alisa, go.
Okay, Arnoud is not going to go first.
I'll say what she says.
I think in 12 months' time, I mean, you're looking at a number of different things that are happening, right? So the liquidity landscape, I think, which Arnoud mentioned, is changing very quickly. Companies are looking at new pools of liquidity, new ways to move it quicker. This is why you see this movement from T5 to T2, now T2 to maybe T1 settlement. I think that's incredibly important. I think the mix of technologies, increasingly, we're not using one technology. It's not just blockchain, it's blockchain and AI, AI, machine learning. So I think there's going to be this much broader mix. I think, ESG is going to continue to accelerate the interest in it, and actual reporting. And what I hope, and this is actually a key part of this, is that we are going to start to see consumers who are willing to pay for this, who are willing to pay for certification that their goods are made in a sustainable way. Not just today, companies are willing to do that because it affects their brand image, but consumers, there's not a whole lot of evidence that consumers will pay more at the basic level for goods that are made in that way. But I think increasingly that's changing, and I think in 12 months' time you'll see a dramatic shift in that.
Thank you. I know you can run, but you can't hide.
No, I was thinking about our roadmap as well, so that's what I'd like it to be. But I think we will see more. I think what I'd like to think is that in 12 months' time, we've seen more adoption, and we're breaking this paralysis that's currently out there, particularly with in the market saying, well, we don't know which platform is going to win, so we're not going to do anything, right? So it's about starting, and it's also understanding that appreciation with companies that the data ownership concept is actually very important. In the old days, you had platform business models competed on ownership of data. If it's my data, it's not yours, right? So I win. And nobody thought about the actual data owner, which is the guy that produced the data in the first, or girl that produced data in the first instance. So what I think is that companies are going to realize in 12 months' time that they own the data. They decide what journey their data is going to take through the ecosystem and the network of networks. It's everybody's platform's job to make a really nice highway with nice restaurants and facilities, etc., and make sure the data stays as long as possible on it. But you can only do that as partnerships. So I see a lot more integration of networks and capabilities to facilitate the future. And through that, I can see an exponential acceleration towards that future of delivery versus payment, integrating various ecosystems and rails. So that's one element. I can also see that within 12 months, the ESG dimension is not necessarily going to lead to an increase in revenue for companies, but I think it becomes part of the license to operate. I think you're out of business if you cannot comply with that, right? So you need to be able to provide that information. I think that's going to be the big one, because the tools are there now, not just us, but other platforms, the tools are there.
Brilliant. It's been absolutely marvelous talking to you both, and you didn't know each other beforehand, but you've really got to know each other during this panel, and it's been absolutely fantastic listening to both of you. I feel like we could have gone on for at least another half hour. Just big takeaways for me. This is about data. This is about running data effectively. This is about sharing data ownership, but also I think it's about building ecosystems, and it's about working together. This is something particularly in the broader ESG domain we've been talking about this week. So it's been fabulous to have you both here. And I'll just say to everyone who is listening in, do join us again at 2 o'clock when we're going to take this discussion around digital technologies and blockchain into the cyberspace and talk about tech wars. Take care. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Alisa.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.